Hello there everyone, my name is David Luchford and welcome to lesson 51 of my Ancient Greek course. In today's lesson we are going to be learning about the words αὐτος and ἑαυτον/ἑαυτον. But before we do that, let's take a look at my virtual sets of shelves. If we do that, we shall see that recently Francesco has kindly bought me another 5 virtual amphorae. In addition, someone has bought me another 3 virtual amphorae, and so has Christine. So Francesco, someone, and Christine, thank you very much for your support. I really appreciate it, and you have completed what was my newest set of shelves. I really appreciate that, thank you. I've got this beautiful collection here now. I mean, it was already beautiful, but now it's even more beautiful, okay? You've maximized the beauty of this wonderful set of shelves. But I have had somebody else support the channel recently, and that is Royce. Royce's amphora is the first on my now newest set of shelves, which is quite a minimalistic one, you know. I decided to go for something quite minimalistic, something quite IKEA. So here we have this minimalistic white set of shelves. I think it's very beautiful. And we've got Royce's Cambridge Blue amphora on the first shelf. Thank you very much, Royce, for continuing to support my channel. I greatly appreciate it. And it's lovely to see that Cambridge Blue colour, as always. But Royce's amphora is a little lonely right now. So if you would like to add a virtual amphora or virtual amphorae to the same set of shelves as Royce's amphora, then you can do so at the link in the description below. While there is space left on the shelves, that is. It's kind of like saying while stocks last, but here it's while there is shelf space. And having thanked my recent supporters, I would just like to say a huge thank you to everyone who has supported my channel in the past also. Your support is so encouraging and I'm so grateful for all of it. I'm also incredibly grateful for all of the likes, comments and subscriptions. So if you enjoy my videos, please do be sure to like this video, to subscribe, and to leave a comment if you have anything to say about the video. And P.S. if you noticed that ancient Greek foot on one of the shelves, that is to commemorate National Flip-Flop Day. Did you celebrate it? Let me know in the comments below. I didn't, because I didn't know that it existed until making this video, but anyway. With that said, let's begin talking about the word αὐτος. Αὐτος is one of the 2 words that we're learning about today. And αὐτος means either himself, herself, itself, or themselves, or the same, or thirdly, him, her, it, or them. There are 3 sets of meanings, really. You've got this first set, himself, herself, itself, and themselves. You've got this second meaning, which is the same. And you've got this third set of meanings, namely him, her, it, and them. So αὐτος does have a range of meanings. And in a moment, I shall explain how we know which of those meanings is being employed when αὐτος is used. Because, thankfully, we don't just have to tell from the context, we can tell from the grammar which meaning of αὐτος is being employed when it's used. But I'll explain how we know that in a moment. For now, please do note down that αὐτος has these meanings. Now, you can see I've put three forms here. I've put αὐτος, ο. You might recognise that that looks the same as εκείνος, ο. One of the two words that we learned about in the last lesson. And I'm pleased to tell you that αὐτος declines just like εκείνος, ο. So if you know how εκείνος changes its endings, then you know how the word αὐτος changes its endings. And to specify which endings εκείνος and αὐτος both use, they both use the normal 2-1-2 endings, except for the fact that in the neuter, nominative and accusative singular, they end in omicron alone rather than omicron new. They end in o. So the neuter, nominative and accusative singular form of αὐτος is αὐτο, as opposed to ἁυτον. Okay, so that's where they differ from a normal 2-1-2 adjective, but otherwise they use the normal 2-1-2 endings. We learned how εκείνος does that same thing in the last lesson. So if you know how εκείνος declines, you know how αὐτος declines. And for that reason, I'm not going to be presenting the declension of αὐτος, because you should already know how εκείνος declines, and therefore you now also know how αὐτος declines. But please do pause the video and ensure that you've noted down that αὐτος declines just like εκείνος. Now that you've done that, we're going to speak about the three ways that αὐτος can be used. And these three ways correspond to the three meanings which I showed you a moment ago. So this is how we know when αὐτος means, for example, himself, herself, etc., or when it means the same, or when it means him, her, it, etc. Firstly, αὐτος can agree with a noun in gender, case and number without being deployed in the sandwich or repeated article constructions. If it agrees with a noun, but not in one of these constructions, then it's emphatic, meaning himself, herself, itself, or themselves. So, if αὐτος is agreeing with a noun, but it's not being deployed in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction, then it means himself, herself, itself, or themselves. And it's being used for emphasis. For example, you could say, I met the Queen herself. Meaning, I didn't just meet some servant of the Queen, I met the Queen herself. That's how αὐτος is used in this sense. Okay, it's used for emphasis. And when it's being used in this way, it can appear in any case, because you could say, I am speaking to the Queen herself. There, the Queen herself would be in the dative. You could say, I saw a corgi of the Queen herself. There, it would be being used in the genitive. So, αὐτος can be used in any case when it's being used in this first way. Let's look at some examples where it's being used with this first set of meanings. Here we have the phrase ho doulos αὐτος. Now, ho doulos is masculine nominative singular. αὐτος is also masculine nominative singular. It's agreeing with ho doulos. However, it isn't going with it in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction. It's just agreeing with it without being deployed in either of those two constructions. Okay? It's next to the definite article and noun. And so, this first set of meanings is being used. Namely, himself, herself, itself, or themselves. We tell from the context which of these ones it is. Since it's the slave, it must be himself. Okay? Since we've got a male slave here, we're going to say the slave himself. The slave himself. In the nominative, that is. What about ten gynaika ἁυτον. Here we've got the woman, or the wife, in the feminine accusative singular. And ἁυτον is also feminine accusative singular. It agrees with ten gynaika. But it's not being deployed in the repeated article construction or the sandwich construction, and so this is meaning the woman herself. The woman herself. Now here, this phrase is in the accusative, so in a sentence, this could be something like, I saw the woman herself. I didn't just see, I don't know, her shadow. I saw the woman herself. So that's how a phrase like this might be used in a sentence. Okay, like I said, you can get αὐτος in this sense in any of the grammatical cases. Let's now talk about the second use of αὐτος, which corresponds to that second meaning. αὐτος can agree with a noun in gender, case, and number and be deployed in the sandwich or repeated article constructions. Here, it means the same. So if αὐτος is agreeing with a noun in gender, case, and number, and it's being deployed in the sandwich or repeated article constructions, then it means the same. It's an adjective there, meaning the same. So for example, if we said ho αὐτος doulos, αὐτος is agreeing with doulos and it's being deployed in the sandwich construction. And therefore here, αὐτος is meaning the same. Okay? So this means the same slave. You could just think of αὐτος as meaning same, because we've got the definite article, which means the, but I've put αὐτος means the same because here it will always have the definite article before it. And so if you have the definite article before it, you just know that the definite article plus αὐτος is meaning the same together. But really, we should say that αὐτος means same, and the definite article is the part that's meaning the, just to be precise. Anyway, so ho αὐτος doulos is the same slave. How about ten ἁυτον gynaika? Here, ἁυτον is agreeing with gynaika once again, since it's feminine accusative singular, and so is ten gynaika, but it's being deployed in the sandwich construction, and so here, ἁυτον is an adjective meaning same. Ten ἁυτον is meaning the same. So this means the same woman. In the sense of, I saw the same woman yesterday, for example. So, these are the first two uses of αὐτος. Both of them have αὐτος agreeing with a noun in gender, case, and number. The difference between them is the first one has αὐτος agreeing with a noun in gender, case, and number but not being deployed in the sandwich or repeated article constructions, while the second one sees αὐτος agree with a noun in gender, case, and number while being deployed in one of those two constructions. And you can see that the meaning differs a lot according to whether it is being deployed in one of those constructions. But in either use of αὐτος, it can appear in any of the grammatical cases. Okay, you could say to the same woman, for instance. You could have this in the dative instead. Likewise, you could have the woman herself in the dative. You could say to the woman herself. So any of the cases can be used here, but the meaning differs according to whether it's deployed in the sandwich or repeated article construction or whether it's not deployed in one of those two constructions. Please do pause the video and note down these two uses of αὐτος. We shall discuss the third use in just a moment. Now let's talk about the third way that αὐτος can be used, corresponding to the third meaning that I showed you at the start. αὐτος can be used on its own, that is to say, not agreeing with any noun in the sentence. If it is being used on its own, then it is functioning as a pronoun, meaning him, her, it, or them, according to its gender and number, as well as the context. I'm just going to interrupt myself to say, although I said not agreeing with any noun in the sentence, I should have said not agreeing with any noun in the clause, that is, in the part of the sentence that αὐτος appears in. Just to be precise. Here, αὐτος will not be used in the nominative case. When αὐτος is being used in this way, it cannot be used in the nominative case. It will always be in any case other than the nominative, that is to say, the accusative case, the genitive case, or the dative case. And that's why we've got the accusative forms of these pronouns here. We've got him, her, it, or them. We say him, her, and them only in cases other than the nominative in English. These are the accusative forms, in fact, of these pronouns. We say him when he is the object of the sentence, the direct object to be precise. So for example, I saw him in the park yesterday. We don't say I saw he in the park yesterday, we say I saw him in the park yesterday, because that's the accusative form of the pronoun. And when αὐτος is used on its own as a pronoun, it will always be used in either the accusative, the genitive, or the dative. It won't be used to mean he, she, it, or they. It will be used to mean him, her, it, or them. Or, if it's in the genitive, then it will be meaning of him, of her, of it, of them, which might be nicer to render as his, her, its, or their in English. Or if it's in the dative, it will be meaning to him, to her, to it, or to them. So, when αὐτος is used on its own as a pronoun, it won't be in the nominative. Okay? Let's now look at some examples of αὐτος being used on its own, that is, not agreeing with any noun, and therefore being used as a pronoun. Here is the sentence, ο δούλος αὐτον χωράει. Here we have the slave in the nominative case. Then we have the verb χωράει at the end, which means he sees, he, she, it sees, but here it's going to be he because the slave is in the nominative, and a doulos is a male slave. So the slave sees αὐτον. αὐτον is the feminine accusative singular form of αὐτος. Now, it's not agreeing with a word in the sentence. It's not agreeing with ο doulos because ο doulos is masculine nominative singular, while αὐτον is feminine accusative singular. So it's being used on its own here, as a pronoun. Since it is feminine and singular, we shall translate it using the word her. So this says, the slave sees her. The slave sees her. Now, all the fact that αὐτον is feminine really guarantees is that it refers to someone or something whose noun is a feminine noun. However, most of the time it will be a female person, and so we'll say her. But just bear in mind that if you had some, I don't know, animal mentioned just before this, which in Greek is a feminine noun, then we might want to say it instead. If the context would imply we would say it in English, although it's feminine in Greek, okay? However, like I said, most of the time it will be able to be rendered as her. And in fact, in today's lesson, it will always work that way. So if it's feminine and singular, we'll say her. If it's masculine and singular, we'll say him. If it's neuter and singular, we'll say it. And if it's plural of any gender, we will say them, okay? But we do have to bear the case in mind as well. So if it's genitive, we need to add of. If it's dative, we need to add to or for, unless there's another reason that it's in the dative case. or the genitive case for that matter. Now, let's look at a second example. Here we have ἑαυτον ἑαυτον πηλei. Here we have the woman in the nominative case. Πηλei means he, she, it loves. Here it's she because the woman is in the nominative. So the woman loves or likes ἁυτον. Ἁυτον is the masculine accusative singular form of αὐτος, and it's being used on its own here. Since it's masculine and singular, we shall translate it using the word him. So this says, the woman loves or likes him. The woman loves him. Let's look at a genitive example. Ο δούλος των χίπων αὐτος χωράει. Here we have the slave in the nominative case. The verb is χωράει. He, she, it sees. Here it's he because the slave is in the nominative. So the slave sees ton hippon, the horse in the accusative. Okay. Αὐτος. Αὐτος is the feminine genitive singular form of αὐτος. But we only have a masculine nominative singular noun and a masculine accusative singular noun. So αὐτος is not agreeing with any noun in the sentence. Therefore, it's being used on its own as a pronoun, and we know that it's feminine genitive singular. Because it's feminine and singular, we say her, but because it's genitive, this means of her. So literally it says the slave sees the horse of her. But in English, we would just say her horse rather than the horse of her. It sounds a bit clunky to say the horse of her in English, so we would say her horse. So this says the slave sees her horse. And this her is someone other than the subject. I mean, we know that because the slave is male anyway, but even if this were the woman instead of the slave, this her would have to be referring to someone other than the subject. Because the word that we're going to meet later in this lesson, ἁυτον or ἑαυτον, refers back to the subject, and that would be used instead. But αὐτος, when it's used in this way, refers to someone other than the subject, always. So this her is going to be a different her than the subject, even if the subject were female. Let's look at a dative example now. Ο δούλος αὐτοϊ λέγει. The slave is in the nominative. Λέγει means he, she, it speaks. So the slave speaks or is speaking αὐτοϊ. Αὐτοϊ is either masculine dative singular or neuter dative singular. And so this either means the slave speaks to him or the slave speaks to it. It's probably going to be a male person here rather than an inanimate thing, although in principle it could be something. However, I have translated it bearing the greater probability of it being a person in mind, and so I've put the slave is speaking to him. You could have said the slave speaks to him, since the present tense can either be does that thing or is doing that thing in Greek. Please do pause the video and note down this third way that αὐτος can be used. Okay, I have created 8 Greek sentences for you to translate into English. The 8th sentence contains just one new noun, which I've glossed for you in the word bank. But you will now be able to translate these sentences with what I've taught you about αὐτος. Each of these sentences uses at least one form of αὐτος. One of the sentences actually uses αὐτος twice. You will need to consult Or if you want to challenge yourself, remember the rules that I've taught you about how to know what αὐτος means when, that is, the uses of αὐτος, and then translate the sentence accordingly. Okay, so bear the rules I've taught you in mind. Please do pause the video and translate these sentences into English. Okay, we're now going to go through the answers. I'm not going to explain these fully, so if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments below. The first sentence is ho philosophos toi basilei audoi akolutei. Here you should have put, the philosopher is accompanying the king himself, or the philosopher accompanies the king himself, or the philosopher follows or is following the king himself. Let me just say that audoi here is agreeing with toi basilei without being deployed in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction, and so it's emphatic, meaning himself. We say himself because we're speaking about the king here, so that's why we know to say himself as opposed to herself or itself or themselves. And the reason that the king is in the dative here is because the verb akolute, or the verb to follow or to accompany, takes its object in the dative rather than the expected accusative. The second sentence is alla philo ἁυτον boai he parthenos. Here you should have put, but I love him, the young woman shouts. Here, ἁυτον is being used on its own, that is, not agreeing with any noun in the sentence, and so it's functioning as a pronoun, and we know to say him because it's masculine accusative singular, the direct object of the love of the speaker. Next we have the sentence ho iatros ἑαυτον ou pile gunaika gar eche. Here you should have put, the doctor does not love her, for he has a wife. Or the doctor does not like her, for he has a wife, but it's probably does not love her in this context, for he has a wife. The crucial point with regard to our focus for today is ἑαυτον is being used on its own as a pronoun. It's not agreeing with a noun in its clause, although it does agree with gunaika, which comes in the clause after it. I should have specified earlier, in fact I will add a note in that you will have heard if you've watched the video until this point, that the rule, although I've put it in terms of sentences, not agreeing with a noun in the sentence, really it's about clauses to be precise, so parts of sentences. But typically it is the sentence as a whole, but this is one of the exceptions where we do have a new feminine accusative singular noun following ἁυτον. Anyway, here it's not agreeing with the noun in its clause, and so we would say her since it's feminine accusative singular. Fourthly, we have diati ai blepestas keiras ἁυτου. Here you should have put, why do you always look at his hands? Or why are you always looking at his hands? Here, ἁυτου is being used on its own as a pronoun, and it's masculine genitive singular. It could in principle be neuter genitive singular, and you could have said its hands, but it's probably his hands, I would expect. So why are you always looking at his hands is the correct translation. Literally it says the hands of him, but we would say his hands more naturally. And here is a beautiful illustration of that sentence. This lady right here is saying, why are you always looking at his hands? You know, because this lady right here seems to have a peculiar fascination with this chap's hands. Anyway, let's continue on. Number 5 is tous persas autus umiso alla ten koran ἁυτον. Here you should have put, I do not hate the Persians themselves, but rather their land. And I should have put a comma in my translation. Okay, the comma's there now. Anyway, here we had ἁυτος being used twice. The first time, it was being used in the first way, agreeing with tous persas, but without being deployed in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction. And so this is saying, I do not hate the Persians themselves, but rather, in the accusative, the land, and then we've got ἁυτον, which is, it could in principle be masculine, feminine, or neuter genitive plural, but given the context, it's going to be masculine genitive plural, talking about the Persians, okay? The land of them, which we render more nicely in English as their land. Sixthly, we have ἑαυτος hopulax autais pisteue. Here you should have put, this guard trusts them. Autais is αὐτος being used on its own in the feminine dative plural. Since it's feminine dative plural, we know it's referring to a subject whose noun would be a feminine noun. But like I said, in this lesson, and most of the time in Greek, it will actually be referring to women. And so we would still say them here, but we know that it's referring to women. I should say that when αὐτος is used as a pronoun, it's less emphatic than when ἑαυτος or ἀκεῖνος is used as a pronoun. Because I think I mentioned in the last lesson that if ἑαυτος or ἀκεῖνος is used in the feminine as a pronoun, you might want to emphasize that it's women. Even in the plural, you might want to say those women, for instance, rather than just them. You could just say them. And actually, I'm questioning what I said in the last lesson now, but sometimes you want to make it clear it's speaking about women with ἑαυτος or ἀκεῖνος being used as a pronoun. But αὐτος is a less emphatic pronoun. It's the standard third person pronoun, actually. Now, the reason they were in the dative is because of the fact that pisteuo, the verb to trust or believe, you could have said believes, takes its object in the dative. And here is an illustration of that sentence. ἑαυτος hopulax autais pisteue. This guard, this geezer right here, is trusting these ladies. They look quite innocuous, so he's letting them enter. Do we trust them? Do we think that they're there to assassinate someone, or are they good people? We're not sure. You know, those smiles might be deceptive, but I understand why the guard trusts them, you know. Seventhly, we have to autoxipos polakis perro. Here you should have put, I often carry the same sword. Here we have αὐτό, sandwiched in between to and xipos. So this is the second use of αὐτος, where it's used as an adjective to mean the same. We know it's being used like that because it's agreeing with xipos and it's being deployed in the sandwich construction, and so it's meaning the same. I often carry the same sword. And number 8 is arhoi athenaioi kai hoi lakedaimonioi ton ἁυτον siton estiusin. Meaning, do the Athenians and the Spartans eat the same food? Now, the crucial point with regard to our focus is here we have ἁυτον in the sandwich construction agreeing with siton, and so it's meaning the same food. We've got the second use of αὐτος here. You could have said the same bread or the same grain, but I've gone for the same food, taking sitos to be being used more generally here. Okay, we're now on to part 2 of this video. Maybe I should have broken this down. This is going to be a long video, you know. If you've got to this point, be sure to give the video a like and let me know in the comments that you've made it this far, okay? Let me know. Say, I reached part 2 of the video. Or if you get to the end, tell me that, you know, because this is going to be a long video, but I hope it's informative. Anyway, we're on to part 2 in that we're now discussing the other word that we're talking about today. We're done with αὐτος for now, and we're moving on to ἁυτον or ἑαυτον. This is the same word, but there are 2 versions of it. One has how at the start, the other has ἑαυτον at the start, but it means the same thing, okay? ἁυτον is the Attic version, the Attic Greek version, that is, it's the version that's used in the dialect spoken in Attica, the region including and surrounding Athens. I might have just said is used. I meant was used in the past. Whereas ἑαυτον is very common in Homer. However, you do sometimes get ἑαυτον even in Attic Greek. So it's good to be aware of both of the versions of this word. And so we'll be doing practice with both of them today. But what does this word mean? It looks similar to αὐτος, and it means something similar, but it's a bit different, okay? So, let me tell you. ἁυτον/ἑαυτον means himself, herself, itself, or themselves. Now you might think, isn't that what αὐτος means when it's used in the first way? And yes, in terms of you translate it in the same way, but this word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον means himself, herself, itself, or themselves in a different sense. Okay? When αὐτος means that, it's emphatic. Okay? It's being used to mean, for example, I saw the queen herself. Meaning I didn't just see a servant, I saw the queen herself. But this word ἑαυτον or ἁυτον is what we call a reflexive word. I'm going to speak about this more in a moment, but reflexive means that it refers back to the subject. Okay? It refers back to the subject, and on top of that, this word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον cannot be nominative, unlike the word αὐτος. Αὐτος, when it's being used emphatically to mean himself, herself, etc., can be nominative, but this word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον has two differences. One, it's got to refer back to the subject of the sentence, whereas αὐτος doesn't have to. In fact, it doesn't unless it's in the nominative. And secondly, the other difference is this word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον cannot be nominative. It's always accusative, genitive, or dative. Okay? A bit like the third use of αὐτος, where it's used as a pronoun and it means him, her, it, or them. There it can't be in the nominative. Likewise, this word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον can't be in the nominative case. Now, concerning how it declines, I have some good news for you. And that is why it's ending in on here and αίαν here. I've given the accusative forms as the standard dictionary forms rather than the nominative because the nominative forms of this word do not exist. However, it should be noted that most dictionaries will use the genitive as the standard form if the nominative doesn't exist. And that's because although the tradition in the UK is to list the accusative following the nominative, it goes nominative, accusative in the UK, elsewhere they list the genitive second. They go nominative, genitive. And so if you look this up in a dictionary, you'll probably find it as ἁυτου or ἑαυτου instead of ἁυτον, ἑαυτον. Anyway, I've got some good news for you concerning how it declines, namely that it declines just like ἐκεῖνος, except for the fact that it does not have any nominative forms. So it uses the same endings as αὐτος and ἐκεῖνος, but it doesn't have any nominative forms. But if you know ἐκεῖνοσ's or αὐτos's endings, then you know how this pronoun declines. Now it should be noted that the way it differs from αὐτος when this version is being used is just in virtue of the fact that it has a rough breathing at the start. Okay? In this version, it's got a rough breathing and epsilon at the start. Okay? But when this version is being used, this contracted Attic version, the only difference visually is the breathing mark. Okay? So you need to be attentive to those breathing marks. Now, just to explain a bit more with regard to what I was saying concerning the meaning of ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον, I've put here the word ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον is always reflexive. That is to say, the word ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον always refers back to the subject of the sentence. It's used, for example, when the subject is doing something to themselves. So, for instance, if you said, the slave is looking at himself, there, himself would either be ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον. It refers back to the person in the nominative, or the people in the nominative, always. The word ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον always refers back to whoever is in the nominative. And that's how you know whether to translate it as himself, herself, itself, or themselves. Now, of course, you do get a clue from the gender and the number as well, but an even easier clue, an even bigger clue, I should say, is who the subject is, because that will tell you how to translate it. So, for example, here we have hodoulos ἑαυτον horai. This says, the slave sees ἑαυτον, himself. We say himself because the slave is the subject and the slave is a guy, one guy in particular. However, it's also masculine accusative singular, so that also confirms that we need to say himself. And this word ἑαυτον is in the accusative because himself is the direct object of the seeing. The slave sees himself. The slave sees himself. Let's look at another example. Here is the sentence χεγούνε ἑαυτον πηλε. Here we have the other version of this word with the he at the start. This says, the woman loves or likes ἑαυτον, herself. The woman loves herself. It's feminine accusative singular, confirming that we should say herself. But as I said, this word always refers back to the subject. And so since the subject is the woman, we must say herself for ἑαυτον. Now this word ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον can also be used in the genitive or the dative. So if we look at a genitive example, this says ο στρατιώτης το ξύπος ἑαυτου πηλε. The soldier, in the nominative, loves or likes το ξύπος, the sword, ἑαυτου. Now we know this must be meaning himself because the soldier is the subject and also this is masculine genitive singular. It could in principle be neuter genitive singular, but the fact that the subject is masculine means it's going to be masculine genitive singular. It's going to be meaning himself, but we need to think about the case. Since it's in the genitive, we're going to say of himself. So literally it says, the soldier loves the sword of himself. But what that means is, the soldier loves his own sword. We could just say his sword. That's a bit ambiguous in English because it could be talking about another guy's sword, but we know that it's his own sword because this is reflexive, meaning of himself. It's referring back to the soldier. We can either say the soldier loves his sword or the soldier loves his own sword if we want to be specific. Let's look at an example using the dative. Hodoulos ἑαυτοι λέγει. The slave, in the nominative, speaks or is speaking ἑαυτοι. That's the word himself, since the slave is the subject, but it's in the dative, and so it means to himself. The slave is speaking to himself. please do pause the video and note down this information about ἑαυτον/ἑαυτον, namely that it always refers back to the subject of the sentence. Now that we've learned that, we can do some practice with the word ἁαυτον/ἑαυτον. All of the sentences that I've created here involve a form of ἁυτον or ἑαυτον. Okay? I haven't included αὐτος in these sentences, so you don't need to worry about distinguishing between αὐτος and ἑαυτον/ἑαυτον just yet. We'll do that in a little while. But we're just focusing on sentences involving ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον for the time being, okay? There is some new vocabulary in the word bank. Please do pause the video and translate these sentences into English. Okay, I'm now going to go through the answers, and I'm going to go through them even more quickly because otherwise this video will be as long as Avatar. So if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments below. The first one is Oi moi ho basileius ἑαυτον apokteinei. This says, oh no, the king is killing himself. ἑαυτον means himself, referring back to the subject, namely the king. Secondly, we have oinos ἑαυτον ou pinei. This says, wine does not drink itself. ἑαυτον refers back to the oinos, the wine, the subject, and although the wine is masculine, given that it's a thing and in English we say itself for things, we're going to say itself here. We wouldn't say the wine does not drink himself in English. So this is one place where the context, seeing who the subject is, overrides the usual way of translating it based on the gender and the number. Thirdly, we have ekeinos chotoxeutes ἑαυτoi ai legei, meaning that archer always speaks to himself. Or you could have said, that archer is always speaking to himself. Fourthly, we have hai partenoi ἑαυτας blepusin. Here you should have put, the young women are looking at themselves, or the young women look at themselves. Fifthly, we have ekeinos hos stratiotes makrotatoi xiphei ἑαυτου pisteiue. Here you should have put, that soldier trusts his very long sword. Sixthly, we have hokleptes houtos ta kremata tates metros ἑαυτου kleptei. Houtos un axios tes mastigos estin. Here you should have put, this thief steals his own mother's money. Therefore, he is worthy of the whip. Complex sentences right here, you know, we're certainly advancing in our Greek. Let me just say that here we had ἑαυτου, meaning of himself. And that's about the mother. So this thief steals the things, you could have said his own mother's things, or possessions, or money, or property, perhaps, for ta kremata. Any of those would have been fine. The ones of the mother of himself. Okay, so it's specifying that it's his own mother, not somebody else's mother, that he's stealing the money of. You could have just said his mother's money, but his own makes it very clear that this is reflexive, referring back to the thief. Okay, I now have a third exercise for you, which is also Greek to English, but I promise it's more varied in that some of these sentences use αὐτος, which we learned about in the first part of this lesson, and some of them use ἁυτον/ἑαυτον. Okay? So you need to look carefully at whether the word resembling αὐτος has a rough or smooth breathing. If it has a rough breathing, then it's going to be ἁυτον / ἑαυτον. If it has a smooth breathing, it's going to be αὐτος, in which case you need to determine which of the uses of αὐτος you have in that particular sentence. Please do pause the video and translate these sentences into English. Okay, let's now go through the answers. Number 1 is hoi politai ἑαυτους αποκτeinousin. This means the citizens are killing themselves. We know it's themselves because we have ἑαυτους with this rough breathing, and so this is reflexive, referring back to the subject, namely the citizens. Whereas the second sentence only differed in virtue of having a smooth breathing here rather than a rough breathing. Hoi politai ἑαυτους αποκτeinousin therefore means the citizens are killing them. Here we have one of the uses of αὐτος. In particular, we've got the third use where it's used on its own as a pronoun. It's not agreeing with politai. Politai is masculine nominative plural, and so it's being used on its own as a noun, and it's meaning them. Since it's masculine and plural, we would say them. The citizens are killing them, and that them is someone other than the citizens. Whereas in that previous example with ἑαυτους, it's reflexive, referring back to the citizens. So in this example, the citizens are killing themselves, whereas in the second sentence, the citizens are killing them, some other people that we don't know in particular. In the context, we would know, it's probably just mentioned who the citizens are killing. But in isolation, in the absence of any context, we just know it's them. We know it's a group of people. Thirdly, chodoulos ekeinos ἑαυτον ai kolasdei dia tas hamartias ἑαυτου means that slave always punishes himself because of his mistakes. What an interesting sentence. We actually had two forms of ἑαυτον here. We had ἑαυτον in the accusative, meaning himself, referring back to the slave. Okay? And he's in the accusative there because he's punishing himself. And then we have ἑαυτου, meaning of himself, also referring back to the slave, but meaning of himself, describing whose mistakes he's punishing himself on account of or because of, namely his own. You could have said his own mistakes if you wanted to be specific, but here, saying his mistakes, I think most people would think you're referring to the slave's mistakes as opposed to another guy's mistakes. Fourthly, we have proston peiraia toi strategoi aŭtoi akolutomen. This means we are accompanying the general himself to the Piraeus. The Piraeus is the port of Athens, and in ancient Greek it was peiraeus, as I informed you in the word bank. But in English we say Piraeus. Anyway, here we had the first use of αὐτος, meaning himself, herself, itself, etc., the emphatic use. Here it's meaning himself because it's agreeing with the general, toi strategoi, in the masculine dative singular, without being deployed in the sandwich or repeated article constructions. And so we would just say the general himself. The reason the general himself is in the dative is because of the fact we've got the verb akoluteor, which takes its object in the dative. Okay, I have a fourth and final exercise for you, and it's an English to Greek translation exercise using both αὐτος and ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον. Now, before you complete it, I have a bit of information for you. And that is pertaining to Greek word order, which, as I've said many times, is very flexible. However, there is a rule concerning αὐτος. Namely, if αὐτος appears at the start of a sentence, it will always mean himself, herself, itself, themselves, etc. Now, that's not to say that it has to appear at the start of a sentence if it's meaning that. It's just to say that when the other uses are being employed, namely meaning the same, or when it's meaning him, her, it, or them, it won't be at the start. Okay? So don't put it at the start if you're using it to mean the same, or if you're using it to mean him, her, it, or them. Okay? Only put it at the start if you want to use it emphatically, meaning himself, herself, itself, themselves. That is αὐτος that I'm speaking about right now, not ἑαυτον. This isn't about ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον. This is about αὐτος, okay? You don't have to put it at the start if you want to use it emphatically, but if it's at the start, then it's used emphatically in Greek. So that's a rule in terms of where we can put the word αὐτος. Now there's one more thing to note, and that is about the verb defeating in sentence 4. Here you should use the Greek verb nikaor, the verb that we've learned as to conquer or to win, because that's the closest thing we've got to the verb to defeat. With that said, please do pause the video and translate these English sentences into ancient Greek. Okay, let's now go through the answers. Number 1 is, oh no, the evil doctor is eating her. Here you should have put, oi moi, hokakos iatros aŭten estie. You could have said estie aŭten. You could have put these two words the other way around. And you could have also put kakos in the repeated article construction to make it agree with iatros. You didn't need to put it in the sandwich construction necessarily. The crucial point with regard to our focus was the word ἁυτον, meaning her. This is αὐτος in the third use, namely when it's used on its own as a pronoun. We need it in the feminine accusative singular to mean her. Secondly, we have the sentence, the strange woman is eating herself. Here you should have put herdena guna ἁυτον or ἑαυτον estie. You could have put dana in the repeated article construction as opposed to the sandwich construction, and you could have had the units of this sentence in different orders, okay? Another order would be acceptable. But the crucial point with regard to our focus was saying ἁυτον or ἑαυτον for herself, because we want the reflexive version of αὐτος, that is ἑαυτον or ἑαυτον, and we want it in the feminine accusative singular, referring back to the woman. Okay? The woman's a feminine noun, but it's accusative here because she herself is the direct object of the verb. She's eating herself, which is a very peculiar thing to do. Thirdly, we have that man loves his own body. Here, you should have said ekeinos ho anthropos to soma 헥tu or 헥tu pile. You didn't need to say ho anthropos, you could have just said ekeinos. You could have used that word on its own as a pronoun to mean that man. But you could have specified if you wanted with ho anthropos as well. You could have put ekeinos on either side of anthropos. On top of that, you could have had the units of the sentence in different orders. The crucial point with regard to our focus was 헥tu or 헥tu, the masculine genitive singular form of 헥ton / 헥ton, meaning of himself, about the body, referring back to the man, since it's his own body, not someone else's body. Fourthly, we have the Persians are running away, for the Greeks are defeating them. Here you should have said hoi Persai apotrekhusin, hoi gar Hellenes autus nikosin. The crucial point with regard to our focus is the word autus. Autus is how we would say them, that is αὐτος being used as a pronoun in the masculine accusative plural to mean them, referring to the Persians. We needed αὐτούς as opposed to ἑαυτος, because αὐτος is the non-reflexive version. It's the version referring to someone other than the subject. Namely, in this instance, the Persians, who, although they were the subject in the first clause, are not the subject in the second clause. The Greeks are the subject in the second clause. And so if this were ἑαυτος here, it would say the Greeks are defeating themselves. But we want to say them, referring to the Persians, and so we use αὐτος in the third way, that is, on its own, as a pronoun. Now, with that said, we can summarize our learning for lesson 51. We've learned that αὐτος means himself, herself, itself, themselves, or the same, or him, her, it, or them. It means himself, etc., if it agrees with a noun without being in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction. It means the same if it agrees with a noun and it is deployed in the sandwich construction or the repeated article construction. And it means him, her, etc., if it is being used on its own, that is, not agreeing with a noun in its clause. We also learned about the word ἁυτον or ἑαυτον. ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον means himself, herself, itself, or themselves. And we learned that this word is reflexive. It always refers back to the subject, and it is never in the nominative. Okay? It does not have nominative forms. It's always accusative, genitive, or dative. Both of these pronouns, αὐτος and ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον, decline like ἐκείνος, except for the fact that ἑαυτον / ἑαυτον does not have any nominative forms. And one thing I've gone this entire video without mentioning is that the word αὐτος gives us the prefix auto in English. Because the prefix auto is about oneself. An autobiography is a biography of one's own life. We have many words that have auto at the start in English, and that's from αὐτος. Now, we have also learned some new vocab today, other than the two main words that we focused on. We've learned two new verbs, namely κολάσδω, meaning punish, and πίνω, meaning drink. In addition, we've learned 4 new nouns. Hamartia, meaning a mistake. In the New Testament, that word means sin, or it can mean sin, at least. It's the word that comes to mean sin in biblical Greek. Mastix means whip. Mater means mother. And note that in the oblique stem, it has an epsilon which drops out in certain forms. It's present in some forms, but drops out in others. I might do a video on the 3A nouns that have this epsilon that's only sometimes there. We might call it a mobile epsilon in a later video. And we also learn the noun Peireios, meaning Piraeus, with the Piraeus being the port of Athens. With all of that said, let me say thank you very much for watching the video today. I have put an ancient Greek frog on the screen to brighten your day, and we can caption this image of this wonderful frog in a way that links back to our learning from today. Because we might say, χούτος χωμπάτραχος ἑαυτον πηλei. How would you translate that? We would translate it by saying, this frog loves or likes himself. Here we have ἑαυτον referring back to the subject, the frog, and so we would say himself. Unless we want to de-gender him in virtue of being an animal and say itself. It's weird. In English, with animals, sometimes we say himself or herself for the animal. Other times we say itself. I think it might depend on whether we know the animal. That seems to be a factor, right? If it's an animal we know, then we would say he, she, and himself, herself, etc. But if it's a distant animal, you might say it. If it's a strange animal, an animal we're unfamiliar with, then we might say it. Like, look at that bear over there. It's eating some salmon, rather than he is eating some salmon. Maybe we need to know the gender before we say he, she with an animal. Maybe that's it. When we're familiar with an animal, we know whether it's a boy or a girl, and so that's when we start saying he or she, I suppose, just thinking about it intuitively as a native speaker of English. Anyway, I'm saying himself for the frog because I feel familiar with this frog. So this frog loves himself. Thank you very much once again, ladies and gentlemen, and I shall see you next time.